He's always endured here. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hunt, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here today. CEQ was originally created to issue guidance to federal agencies on how to comply with NEPA. Nevertheless, everyone in this room knows the CEQ has grown into an action arm for President Biden's radical eco agenda. Look no further than the Biden administration's settlement with the Sierra Club over a possible sighting of a rhesus whale in the Gulf of Mexico almost a decade ago. It's insanity. Instead of simply overseeing NEPA compliance, the CEQ is reshaping federal agencies as a vehicle of social change and leading the war on domestic energy production. CEQ and Biden's White House they care far more about ESG than they care about the American public and our livelihood and what we're going to do about having energy abundance for our future. Mr. Loyola, sir, thank you for being here. In your testimony, you mentioned that the American people need to understand that the goal of net zero is a fantasy, and given the delays and uncertainties of the permitting process. Could you elaborate that on that, please? And for the record, sir, I'm from Houston, Texas. The entire energy corridor is in my district, so I can't agree more with this statement, but I would love for you to speak a little bit more about that, please.
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman Hunt. I would say that under current law, there are enormous constraints on the ability to deploy renewable energy on the scale and at the speed that would be required. Just to give an example, the Princeton Net Zero study talks about requiring 500 gigabytes of new solar capacity. That's about 1,000 utility scale solar plants that would need to be built. That's an area approximately the size of New Jersey covered in solar panels.
Wow.
And I'll just point out, in the Snake River dams that we've been talking about, there's many very sympathetic stories on the ground of stakeholders. Every single renewable energy project has similar stories and has similar people opposing them. And the problem with the NEPA process is that it elevates small pockets, what can sometimes be very small pockets of local opposition, over national policy priorities, and it's happening even with respect to the national policy priorities of the current administration, which hasn't been able to increase the rate at which renewable energy gets permitted because of this sort of local opposition. The problems operate at two levels. One of them is that the risks to any particular project are so enormous because of the uncertainties of the process that those projects in the project application phase, during the NEPA phase, have only very restricted access to financing. Only people who can afford to lose $25 or $30 million or $100 million on a permit application, who can literally afford to throw that money away, waiting for someone to call them back, and are only tempted to get into a project because of the promise of exorbitant returns on investment, which is a premium that is passed on to consumers eventually.
Always.
So all of these inefficiencies come at a great cost. And then the macro level issue, which I discussed a moment ago, which is that the entire process is so taxing of agency staff resources that the entire federal government's only able to produce 70 or 80 EISs a year. The entire federal government, in the last year, I mean, I don't know this for a fact, I'll take it for the record, but in the last year, I bet that the entire federal government has only issued 3 or 4 solar project permit applications. And in order to get to net zero, they have to build 1,000 solar plants and have them operational before 2035. So, I mean, I'm not a mathematician or anything, but doing the math, I don't see how they're gonna get there. And so I think the principle that we followed in the Trump administration was that the uncertainties and inefficiencies of the NEPA process hurt everybody.
Yes.
And that making the process more predictable would be a benefit to everybody. Maybe not the litigation, the cottage industry of litigation groups that has grown up challenging agency actions. But again, I don't see this as a partisan issue of Republicans versus Democrats. I see this as public interest versus special interests. And so what we tried to do and what CEQ will hopefully do in the future is to put the public interest in efficient and effective agency action first and try to streamline the NEPA process as called for in the Fiscal Responsibility Act.
Thank you very much for your answer, and I will yield back the rest of my time. And thank you, sir.
I think the gentleman from Texas, the gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized for her 5 minutes.
All right, well, thank you so much, Ms.